Good day to one and all, and welcome to the show. I have with me today a very special guest, my friend Eirik Westcoat, who is a scholar of the Norse world and also an authentic poet in the Nordic tradition. Eirik, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Dan. My name is Eirik Westcoat. I write poetry in the Viking Meters to bring the old gods and the old ways to the modern world. Just last year, I completed a degree in Viking and medieval Norse studies at the universities of Iceland and Oslo, and more recently finished up and published my first book of poetry titled Viking Poetry for Heathen Rites, Asatru liturgy in traditional verse.
Right, and this is what we will be exploring today chiefly, and that is the poetic tradition of the Norse people. Something that is of, I think, exceeding importance to the Norse tradition in terms of poetry is this idea of poetic madness. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, that's a wonderful concept in the Old Norse mythology, and that's definitely something I'd like to bring back today in part. And that's the idea that poetry in the Norse tradition is strongly connected with notions of fury and madness, or the Old Norse term was Óðir, or in Old English, woad. And I tend to borrow the Old English into modern English for my usage. And this is also caught up with ideas of poetry being equated to an intoxicating drink. And not surprising, all of these are kind of under the same roof of Óðinn, the Norse god of all these things, madness, fury, and also berserkers, and other forms of violence.
Right, and there's a real kind of, I suppose, martial aspect of poetry in the Norse tradition. I mean, boasting and the proud displays of kind of exuberance. These are rich traditions in the poetry of the Norse.
Yes, we do get that, especially with scenes of boasting and feasting halls in Beowulf, and a few that show up in some of the Icelandic sagas, where there is a record of a toast, sort of toasts to Óðinn in particular for victory.
Now, something that I'm kind of perplexed by is that there is this kind of contradiction at work, and this occurs in the Greek poetic world as well, and that is that poetry is brought on by a kind of madness, but the poetry that we're talking about is very strictly metered. It is very strictly organized. How do we reconcile those two traditions? I mean, I know Nietzsche talks about the Apollonian and the Dionysian and that tension that's at work in Greek civilization, and that this bubbles up to the surface in the form of Greek tragedy, which is a union of these two concepts. I wonder if there is kind of a Norse angle to this idea.
Yeah, that may be a manifestation of similar things in the Norse tradition. I don't have particular older sources on it, but I would see it from a modern perspective as it is kind of a synthesis of opposites, maybe comparing a bit to, again, the Greek material, where they saw like virtue being as something as a moderation between extremes.
Right.
And then in the same case that the final result of a poem may be thought of as a synthesis between those two extremes of the fury and wildness and madness, and also a strict order.
Now, do you think it was just that these people had so thoroughly embodied their poetic traditions that they didn't even really have to think about it? It's sort of like freestyle hip-hop. You know, they don't have to rehearse anything beforehand. They just develop the skill and the facility of using their language to fill whatever meter they need to fill.
Yes, I think it's definitely that. Many of the old sagas and other material, it mentions about poets who can create poetry as fast as they can talk.
Hmm.
And there's even, I guess, records of some cases like contests where they make of it, of speed composition, where one person, I believe, who has offended a particular king, he's tasked with coming up with a poem by the time it takes a certain other person to walk from one side of the room to the other. Otherwise, he would lose his head or something, and he succeeds with the poem.
That's awesome. So, what are the meters that are most popular, or is there maybe a micro history of meter in terms of Norse poetry that you could give us?
Okay, yes, I think there's about some of the they're all capable of fine distinctions, but to give them into a couple broad families and some distinctions, there's the meters that are used for the Eddic poetry, such as like the tales about the gods and the heroes. And these are fairly simple, straightforward, alliterative meters. Yeah, there's two very similar ones, Fornir the Slag and Leo the Houter. And their lines work there. The lines connected by alliteration, the initial sounds of particular stressed words. And that rhyme is generally not a factor there. And but those are the main two, and there's a few other more minor meters. And then there's a different kind of the more elaborate poetry, the meter that which is sometimes referred to as Skaldic poetry. There's an academic distinction between Eddic and Skaldic. It has its usefulness at times, but anyway, the Skaldic meters, the most famous of these is one called Drokvet, and it has its variants, but the basic form, it has alliteration, and it also has a very particular interlocking set of rhymes in it. And then it also has a strict syllable count per line. And these meters have been rightfully so called, they've been called fiendishly difficult to compose in. These more elaborate meters would tend to be the ones of choice for praise poems for kings and chieftains. But also because of their elaborate nature and difficulty to write in, the language tended to be very obscure. There would be kennings and metaphors and odd word orders that would make it very difficult to interpret. And there's even saga stories about someone hearing and learning a verse by heart, and then as they're walking home, unpacking what it actually means.
So you make it a, let's say, personal responsibility to revive these traditions and continue their existence. Now, we're going to be giving probably some examples of this through your poetry. Eirik's just put out a book, and you've recorded segments of your poetry for that book, and we're going to play some of that for you guys, and hopefully you enjoy it, and you can check out Eirik's book if you want to get more of it. But this is definitely something that is oral and aural. It's something that has to be heard because the meter is so important, and it's not everybody who can just sing meter in their head. These things are learned. These are traditions that you actually have to go out and acquire the knowledge to perform them. They're not intuitive. And I think this is something that separates our modern poetry from ancient poetry very much, is that, today anybody can sort of scribble lines on a page and say, this is my poem. Love it for what it is because it's me and it's special. Well, that's nice, but there are certain traditions that you had to work in the ancient world to actually be considered a poet. You couldn't just say whatever. That wasn't the case. It was almost always metrical. So we're going to play one of these poems now. Which would you like to begin with, Eirik?
Okay, I think the first one I'd like to begin with, I'll give that a short introduction.
Okay.
And about some of the uses of the poetry, and I guess with the nature of my book. My particular book is, I think, quite unlike many other poetry books. I guess to give an example, the ancient Indo-European religions, they all had the Greeks and the Vedic peoples and the Romans and so forth. They had their poetic liturgy, probably all of those traditions at some point. And so my book is about writing poetry for ritual use to return it to that root. And there's a couple of different ways that can be done here. And okay, the first would involve, I guess, telling the traditional stories from the lore. We have surviving in a work by Snorri Sturluson called the Prose Edda, several interesting tales that we might presume at one point existed as poetry. But here in the Prose Edda, they're just as prose tales. And for some of my poems, I've written, taken those prose tales and turned them back into poetry, and to tell the traditional stories from the lore. Okay, that's what this first poem, titled Building Asgard's Wall, is about. It is one of those stories, and it is a humorous one as well.
Silence I seek for saying my tale of the master mason who meant to build for the garth of the gods the greatest of walls. With Yggsale now I utter my words. Midgard was made, and mighty Valhall, for proof against the passage of Ettins, the Aesir sought a solid defense. A builder offered the best of walls. The sun and moon he sought as payment, and Freya to wed as fairest wife. The Aesir allowed only a winter. If unfinished the fort, then forfeit his wage. Alone he must labor, allowed no help. An exception he sought, Svavalfari his horse, and Loki arranged that the right be granted. With winter's start, the work was begun. The stallion's work startled the gods. He steadily hauled the heavy stones, always at night, and every day the builder labored to lay the wall. Fast proceeded the fort's assembly. By summer's start it would stand complete. The Aesir assembled on seats of judgment to moot on their doom and deem a response. It was soon decided that the son of Laufey should bear the blame for the blight approaching. Thus Loki must manage that the mason forfeit, or Loft would lose his life for failing. When evening came, out ran a mare who neighed to distract the stallion from work. Away he wended towards the mare, with the hapless builder hurrying after. The chase continued, taking all night. The stallion's running had stopped the work. With day's dawning, deduced the mason that for certain his fee forfeit would be. The mason raged with wrath of Ettins for all to see. The Aesir summoned Thor from the east to thrash the Ettin. With Mjolnir's power, he paid his wage. But Svavalfari had sated himself on Loki, and some time after, Sleipnir was born, 8-footed and grey, an awesome steed, amongst the gods and men the best.
All right, so that was, what was it called again?
Building Asgard's Wall.
Okay, thank you. And do you have any additional commentary that you would like to add to this?
If we could go into a second poem before we go on to other matters, closely related on that note. It is another thing we can do is there's lots of lore about ancient stories and mythologies, and we can synthesize that into new wholes and for new purposes. And the second poem does that, and it is called Valhalla, about the most famous building in the Norse mythology.
A spell of the lore I speak to you now, by pouring Hroft's powerful drink. I sing of that hall, high on the tree, to warriors dead 'tis a welcome sight. 'Tis roofed with shields and raftered with spears, grand and glorious in Gladsheim stands, that greatest hall of gods and heroes, where sturdy benches are strewn with mail. A wolf is lurking at the western door, and high above hovers an eagle. Fish are running in the river nearby, mistletoes in the west, a mite of a tree. The leaves are eaten from Larath by Heathen, mead from her udders is the Einherjar's drink. The limbs are eaten from Larath by Eikthirnir, dew from his horns drops into Vergelmir. The gate Valgrind is guarding the doors, 5 of hundreds and 40 more. The Einherjar go, 800 per door, on the day of doom for deadly battle. In the kettle Eldhrimnir, the cook Andhrimnir sieves Seirimnir, that succulent pork. The Einherjar eat that excellent fare, but the food of Vegtum is fed to his wolves. The wise one lives on wine alone, his ravens fly roaming the world. The Valkyries serve victory father, and after the battles, the Einherjar's feasting. Bragi relates lore to Aegir, swords shimmering are the source of light. Sigmund and Sinfjotli receive the guests, from fields of battle fresh they arrive. Hrungnir challenged Hlorrithi to duel, he dared to boast, drunk in that hall. Glasir gleaming with golden leaf is standing in front of the famous stead. That hall is sought by heroes and skalds, both far and wide its fame has spread. Standing strongest, that stead is best, it is Óðinn's own, awesome Valhalla.
So this poem, tell me more about it, and in conjunction with the last one as well. Maybe something about the meter as well.
Okay. Both of those poems use one of the meters I mentioned earlier called Fornir the Slag, which can mean something like old story meter or meter of old words. And this is believed to be one of the oldest of the Norse meters. And its basic construction is there's a line that would consist of 2 half lines, and they're linked by alliterating syllables, 1 or 2 in the first line with 1 in the second line. Okay, and the best way to do that would be to give an example of that. Okay, I can give an example here of one of those lines of Fornir the Slag from that first poem, Valhalla, from the very beginning, that went, a spell of the lore, I speak to you now. Okay, if you may have noticed the pause in the middle there, there's the 2 half lines. The first is a spell of the lore, and the second one, I speak to you now. And those are both linked by the sp sound on spell and speak. Okay, and then the poetry is broken into stanzas. Like a line such as the one I just mentioned is then is accompanied by 3 more to make a full 4-line stanza, and then just stanzas follow after that for the length of the poem.
So, could you go into some detail about what this kind of poetry means to you in terms of your revival of it? What kind of meaning, like, is this something that you feel, let's say, almost a religious vocation towards doing? Is it like that sort of thing, a calling? Where did you get the idea or the inspiration to start this kind of project?
And yes, I do see that as a calling for these particular forms.
So did you start these things when you read Snorri, for example, or were you inspired at a previous date? Like, did you start writing poetry when you were younger and then eventually adopted the forms, or did you start right with the forms?
Okay, what it really started at, and I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, as this was a matter of a number of years ago. a lot of internal self-work on an initiatory path with the runes. And I guess for this I had my own experience of the Old Norse poetic Mead of Odin. And I guess that inspired me. Specifically, it was the sense that in some way or another, the Old Norse poetic Mead of Odin is absolutely real.
Right.
But of course, that does not answer the question in what way it is real. And that's a very long and involved question that may take one a lifetime to try to answer. But that experience did lead me to embracing an inner sense of creativity, and it just ended up coming out as Old Norse style poetry. So I was exploring everything to do with Odin, like so that was the natural place to start, with the mythology that went with it and with the poetic forms that also went with it.
And so from there, you had an interest in the languages beforehand, I assume. Have you attempted to do any of this poetry in the native languages?
Yes, I have written, but it's only a very small amount of poetry so far in the original languages. The longest piece I have is actually in Old English, and it is about some of the runes. Some background on that is necessary. There's the Old English Futhorc runes. There's an old manuscript in which has the Old English rune poem in it, and it gives runes and stanzas for 29 runes. But however, the manuscript also lists an additional 4 runes, but it does not give them any poetic stanzas. What I did a number of years ago was to write poetic stanzas in Old English for those other 4 runes. At least we do have a starting point on these particular 4 runes to go with, and which would be the names of the 4 runes. And then it can be a matter of looking into the older sources on what significance these names would have had to perhaps the Old English peoples around, maybe like from the period 700 to 1000. And then a lot of it is to try to channel creative inspiration for the themes to use. Some of it was meditative work, a lot of it for the kind of the scholarly background and the interesting themes. I took as my starting point from Edred Thorson's book Alu. He discusses the possibility. First he talks about the names of these 4 runes and what they might have meant to like the older Germanic peoples. And he also raises an interesting speculation that I decided to make use of as to whether the last 3 of those runes were in some way connected to the Grail mysteries. I would say Christianity was involved at some point, although not entirely clear. It's certainly a case England had become Christianized early, and certainly the church was making use of runes. They did not try to get rid of the tradition. There's some Christian runic monuments that pop up in England, but it's not at all clear when these particular last 4 runes got their names, or exactly when they might have been added to the Futhorc. But it does seem likely it was probably during Christian times.
All right, well, let's then maybe get back on track with some more of your poetry. What's next on the list?
Okay, this will be a short one, so we can follow it up with another poem after that. But first I want to say, I guess, about this first poem would be about using the older texts as a model. One thing we see in like the early Middle Ages is we see Christianity taking pagan or heathen things and repurposing them for Christian use. And one can run this in the other direction in the modern age fairly easily. And in Old English, there is a particular piece of poetry called Cadmon's Hymn. And I made a very loose, heathenized translation of it. after I heard someone suggest at an academic conference that the various names that are used for the Christian god in this piece of poetry all strongly resemble the names or kennings of various heathen gods. It's like there's a phrase in the original Cadmon's hymn that would remind one of Heimdall, another one that would remind one of Tyr, another one for Freyr, and then there's a few for Odin as well.
And these have been syncretized with names for Jehovah or Yahweh.
Well, I guess sort of in the way they're used there, they're not so much. They're almost still used, almost to the point where you could see the heathenization just barely under the surface. Like they would use the phrase "heaven's warder" in the Old English, and that might remind one of Heimdall. A word,
or the angel Michael. Would that be what is insinuated, though, from the Christian perspective, or is it unclear?
Well, no. What's insinuated from the Christian perspective of this 9-line poem is they're all supposed to be like names of the Christian god. Yeah, like things like heaven's warder. Then there's other words like eternal lord, and then actually a name. The Old Norse Freyr, the corresponding Old English Freya, is actually used as a name for God in this poem.
Wow!
So it's a name meaning Lord, and it's not very far at all removed from. Say,
well, I mean, it's like we sort of use the term Easter for our Christian holiday. I mean, and it's right there in the name.
Okay, and then another Old English word, Drighten, which originally goes back to, has connotations of like a warlord or war leader, and that would remind one of perhaps something that would be appropriate to apply to Odin.
All right, so let's play some of these poems. We'll play 2 of them back to back. So what are the 2 names of them?
Okay, it's actually, the second one goes on a completely different direction. So we should give that an introduction after that.
Okay, so we'll play the first poem, and then we will talk about that for a little bit, and then we'll play the second one.
Heimdall we praise, heaven's warder, and measuring tears, might and wisdom, and Woden's works of wondrous glory, that eternal Drighten from time's beginning. The worlds were shaped for shining offspring, with heaven as a roof by that holy ruler. Midgard he made, mankind's patron, and that eternal Drighten truly adorned the earth with men for Yngvi's blessings.
All right, so the name of that one was...
I call my modern heathenized translation of that Eirik's hymn. I believe it kicks off my my online audio download.
Ah, I see. Yes, because I saw it at the front of the list there. I should mention that you can actually get these recordings over at BandCamp, which is a pretty useful platform in terms of getting music out to people and this sort of thing. So this next poem coming up, what's it called, and what can you tell us about it?
Okay, this next one is named Gunnlaðrljóð. Okay, and this is sort of a journey into more of innovation of the lore. Because there's the lore gives us a lot of stories to enjoy, but one doesn't have to look too hard to see that there's directions where it can be extended, like if there's sort of or to fill in the gaps, so to speak, and to try to expand things with material that makes sense. A sort of experimental archaeology for literature, for instance. And that's what's done in this poem. And it is about Odin's winning of the Mead of poetry. And Snorri tells that story in his Edda. But this poem, I guess, came from the question of what might it have been like from the perspective of Gunnlóð in the story.
All right, well, let's give it a listen, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about Odin's Mead.
Home at Hnitbjörg, a hall in a mountain, the daughter of Suttung dwelled. Gorgeous Gunnlóð was guarding his mead, that guild from dwarves he gained. Suttung savored for himself alone the precious and potent mead, though that symbol sat, unsipped by all, in a room so deep and dark. Gunnlóð sat on her golden stool and dreamed of worlds all wide, tales of heroes from travelers she heard, those stories of might and main. She hoped that a hero would hie for the mead and relieve her lonely days. Well she knew that the wondrous brew had a better and brighter weird. By stone grinding she was startled one day from her bed of brooding dreams. A hole appeared in the hardened wall. Was it the hoped-for hero? With bated breath from her bed she rose, as a serpent slithered out. Before her eyes its form had altered to the Aus she knew was Óðinn. Óðinn asked to earn the mead that Gunnlóð guarded there. Her lust inflamed, she allowed to him her help to win that wine. Secured it was by crafty spells and powerful chants and charms. Galdr they'd need to gain its release, and thus keep power from harm. Sexual save and sorcery they worked, grinding together with lust. Nights all three they needed to finish the magic to ready the mead. Their working done, they wended then to the cauldrons keeping the mead. Óðinn sat in eager suspense on the stool of glowing gold. Gunnlóð gave to gout Óðrerir, then Boðin and Son to swig. In sorrow she served those sips of mead, for she knew he'd not return. Grímnir altered to glorious eagle and soared in searing sky, leaving Gunnlóð alone to grieve for the hero she helped and loved.
Well, what more could you tell us about the Mead of Odin? Or I don't even know if it necessarily pertains to him specifically. Does it pertain to him? Is he the creator of it? Or is it something that he has access to and it's separate from him in some sense?
Yes, it's definitely the last part, that he has access to it and it's separate from it in some sense. To give the short version of, I guess, the background story from that poem, the way Snorri tells it, is first, in the beginning of time, the Aesir and Vanir are the two tribes of gods are in a war with each other. But eventually they pretty much fight to a standstill and decide to declare truce. And as a sign of their truce, they all go and spit into a kettle. So that may have some overtones of ancient ceremonies for peacemaking. And they decide, rather than to let this token of their truce go to waste, and being gods, they decide to make a being out of it. And the being they make out of it is named Kvasir. He ends up being the wisest of all the gods. And goes around teaching his knowledge throughout the worlds. Eventually comes to a pair of dwarves. And the dwarves take him aside and kill him. But the dwarves, being industrious and crafty creatures that they are, this was not a senseless killing, but rather they drain his blood, mix it with honey, and they brew a special mead out of it, a mead that turns anyone who drinks it into a poet or scholar. And it's not said if the dwarves managed to make much use of this mead, because they're a bit bloodthirsty, and they end up later on killing this giant and his wife who'd come to visit. And however, this giant and this wife, they have a son who is very angry and comes to avenge the death of his parents at the hand of these dwarves. And so he takes the dwarves and ties them out on a skerry that will be flooded at high tide. And so the dwarves are begging for their life, and they decide to offer this giant, who's named Suttung, as a ransom and compensation for the death of his parents, this magical mead they've brewed. Suttung accepts their offer, and we never hear from the dwarves again, but then Suttung takes the mead back to his home in a mountain hall called Hnitbjorg, and he sets his daughter Gunnlóð to guard this mead. And from what we can tell, Suttung doesn't make much use of it himself. But at this point we have this magic mead, which is made from the blood of a murder victim, and so it's, I guess, in some way stolen property after a fashion.
It's in Asgard, or where is it at this point?
It's presumably somewhere in Jotunheim. The geography can be a bit vague at times here, but it's definitely not in Asgard.
Okay.
And somehow or other, Óðinn hears about this mead, and it seems that he does know where it came from, that it's and what its powers are, because he is quite determined to get it at any cost. And he engages in a ruse. He first arranges this. Now, first, this guy Suttung has a brother named Baugi, and Óðinn goes in disguise and arranges for Baugi's 9 slaves to all kill each other. And so then later that night, Óðinn shows up at Baugi's house for lodging, and then Baugi's complaining, "What am I going to do about the harvest? All of my slaves killed each other." And there's Óðinn ready to offer to do the work of these 9 slaves for a whole summer, and all he would like in return for it is a sip of the mead that Suttung has. Yeah, Baugi's pretty desperate, but says, "Yeah, I can't control what my brother does with mead, but I'll try what I can to get it for you." So summer passes. Óðinn does all the work. They go over to Hnitbjorg and Suttung to get Óðinn some of the mead. Suttung completely refuses and sends them away. And so Óðinn convinces Baugi to try a trick, and that's to drill a hole in the mountain. And Baugi does this. And that's how Óðinn gets into the mountain and meets Gunnlóð, as recounted in the poem. It's said that Óðinn spends 3 nights with Gunnlóð, and then Gunnlóð lets Óðinn have 3 sips of mead. Then Óðinn, having quite an enormous, I guess, jaw and stomach capacity, empties out the mead in 3 giant gulps. So he has all the mead, then he transforms into an eagle and flies back to Asgard with it. And then the Aesir see that Óðinn is coming back, and they know he has mead with him, so they set out their pots, and then as Óðinn returns, he upchucks the mead back out into those pots. And so the mead is then safely back into Asgard, where Óðinn distributes it to gods and humans who are skilled at composing poetry. But it's said that, however, on the return of the mead was not so easy, because at one point Suttung saw him getting away. Suttung then turned himself into an eagle as well and started chasing. And the chase was close enough at some point that Óðinn excreted some of the mead. And this portion is a portion that anyone can get, and it's called the Fool Poet's Share.
Yes, do tell about this.
Okay, then, I guess that this is the part. This is the part that all the bad poets in the world randomly find and manage to drink somehow.
It's the bad poetry Kool-Aid.
Yes, pops up in later Norse sources that the phrase "mud of the eagle" is used for bad poetry.
Nice. Bird shit.
Yep.
All right. Now, we're talking about Asgard and Midgard and all this kind of stuff. Could we go into some detail over the geography of the Norse cosmology, what with Yggdrasil and its tree and all of its levels. If you could describe that.
Okay, in the Old Norse cosmology, at least according to Snorri and perhaps a few other sources that he was drawing on, the universe is conceived of as a giant tree. And here it's named Yggdrasil. And there's an enormous number of things to tell about Yggdrasil. We'll start with the cosmology. It's thought of as consisting of 9 different worlds, or sort of realms of being. In modern parlance, we might use the phrase alternate dimensions, or something similar.
Yeah. Parallel universes.
Mm-hmm. And in the layout, Midgard, or the physical realm that humans inhabit, is thought to be in the middle of this tree. And I guess some of the sources are a bit fuzzy on the exact layout, but one way to think of it, and this is a model used in Edred Thorson's books, for instance, would be to think of course, as Midgard in the middle, and then above it would be a realm of what are called the elves or light elves, called Ljósálfheim. And then above that, at the top of the tree, would be Asgard, the realm of the gods. And then below Midgard would be Svartalfheim, the land of the dwarves or dark elves. And then further below that would be Hel, or the abode of the dead. And then perhaps set up around Midgard, generally thought of as symbolically being in the cardinal directions, would be Niflheim, or a world of ice to the north, and Muspelheim, a world of fire to the south. And then to the west, Vanaheim, where the Vanir tribe of gods is from. And then to the east, Jotunheim, or where the Jotuns or Ettins are from. Again, I would want to emphasize that that's just one way of looking at the geography of Yggdrasil.
Right. This was not standardized.
That's correct.
A way that we think of it today. We can talk about Nordic religion in the same way we talk about Hinduism, in that Hinduism is not a real thing. It's just a word that is used as an umbrella term to cover all of the religious variety in India. So in the Nordic tradition, it's similar. There are no standardized traditions, but the languages and the gods provide a consistency from one tribe to another.
Yes. And one can find now on the internet, there are lots of artistic renderings of Yggdrasil, very creative ones, where they will try to draw Yggdrasil as a tree and then map all of these different places in a less linear, systematized fashion. And a lot of them are quite beautiful and inspiring.
Yeah, I really do enjoy looking at all the various artists' renderings of them, especially with the serpent climbing up the tree from the roots, and the eagle in the top portion. What can you say about those?
Okay, the serpent and the eagle. Okay. There's a lot of animals living in the world tree, and I guess there's a serpent among the roots. Or did you say a serpent surrounding it, or a serpent?
Oh, yeah. Roots? Well, I suppose he's in the roots.
Okay, there's actually 2 serpents. We'll go with the one in the roots here. There's one among the roots called Nidhogg, and he would be he's depicted as gnawing on those roots, and in other, at least in one source, he's also depicted as gnawing on corpses. So he seems like a fairly unsavory character. And then at the top of the tree, there is an eagle, and it's not clear what he's doing. he's not described as eating anything, but he is described as having a hawk sitting between his eyes.
Right. What's the deal with that?
Nobody knows. That is a detail that Snorri mentions, but he offers no explanation for why the hawk is sitting in between its eyes. One modern interpretation of that, and one I think that could be useful with enough meditation, is that the eagle may in some sense represent the conscious self or the ego, and the hawk would be the observing self.
Right. The one who is aware that he is aware.
Yes. And of course that would, continuing that metaphor, that would make Nidhogg, or the serpent, something to do with the unconscious. And if one wanted to get really, really adventurous, possibly try to connect it to the Kundalini from the Hindu tradition.
Right.
But then also in the world tree, there is a squirrel who is named Ratatosk, who is said to run up and down along the trunk of the tree and carrying insults back and forth between the eagle and the serpent.
So is this like Hermes, practically? Like, just rushing up and down?
Quite possibly. Now, it's not said why the serpent and the eagle are trading insults, nor is it said why the squirrel is aiding them in this business. But that did become the inspiration for me to write a poem, and that we can make that the next poem here.
Okay.
But a few more words of introduction on that is that one can also take the lore and try to make sort of wisdom tales out of it. Things that are inspirational for meditation or communicating esoteric insights. And it can also be done in a humorous fashion, as that was the original impulse behind this next poem, is I set out to write something with a bit more humor in it than most of the other stuff I've written. Okay, and the name of this one is called Wundermal, which translates to the sayings of slander, and it's about what the eagle and the serpent and the squirrel might be saying to each other.
The towering tree is topped by an eagle who scorns the serpent for scores of slights. Haughty, headstrong, and highfalutin, that proudest bird is puffed up well. Deep in the roots a dragon lurks, bitter with bile, biting corpses. Sour and surly, with searing hate for that damned eagle, the dragon smolders. Both up and down an acorn runs, along the trunk of that lofty tree. He whisks the words of the Weirman eagle, both back and forth, those bitter insults. Now you may hear some nuggets of speech that pass between those prideful ones, in reading here thus the runes of the squirrel. Be wary of finding that woe within. The eagle said, "Scurry, my squirrel, and scamper quickly. Let that serpent slime hear slanderous words. Supreme I am o'er the piddly snake, because my view reveals all knowledge." The serpent said, "Scurry, my squirrel, and scamper quickly. Let that carrion bird hear accusing words. I lord over realms that lout can't see. I simply don't value the view he has." The squirrel said, "The saw he said is slander surely, O wisest wight of worlds all nine. That jerk deserves rejoinders many. Repay his gift with a prideful gild." And so it goes, that senseless gab. Can the hapless hawk give help at all? Where is the tree of this wisdom tale? Can elm or ash offer assistance?
So this poem is sincere but not serious.
No, I would say it is sincere and it is serious in its own way. Of course, can be open to perhaps a number of different interpretations. as to what it means with the eagle and the serpent. Whether one sees them as parts of one's conscious and unconscious self.
Right. That's certainly how Jung viewed the serpent and the eagle, and Nietzsche as well. I mean, there's a very rich tradition in Western esotericism in general, even including Indian esotericism, all the way to Scandinavia, to associate that the snake and the eagle, or the bird in general, with the subconscious and the, maybe let's say, superconscious state. Mm-hmm. So what more could you tell us about this poem?
Well, I do like to perform this one live a lot, especially it is a lot of fun to do the different voices for the different animals in there.
Now, do we have any last poems before we close up our talk for today?
Yes. Another poem. I guess that another purpose we can do with the old poetry is for celebration and praise. And so, this was a poem, and it was also, I guess, for a religious ritual. This was called Summer Tímadraupa. I guess it debuted at one of my Asatru kindred's ritual blessings in celebration of summer. And it is a little bit more ornate in some fashions, and it is called a draupa. It is a particular type of poem that has a refrain.
This song I brewed with sweetest honey to celebrate summer and sun's bright light. I made this mead with mirth today to fill the folk with frolic and joy. Sif and Idun and Suna we hail for golden growth in this greatest time. Sweet summer is of seasons best, with birds and beasts to brighten the world. In sun and warmth we celebrate life. The longer days lift our spirits. It is greeted as well by the gods we honor, for the force of life is flowing strongest. For the spirit of life in this special time, summer and sunshine we celebrate now. The strong sunshine and storms of summer will grow the crops that grace our tables. The harvest's bounty is ahead for us, from brightest light, the best of food. The warmth of summer is welcomed by flowers, bright and fragrant, they bloom this season. Their nourishing nectar is needed by bees, for the honey made into heathen's mead. For the blessings brought by brighter light, summer and sunshine we celebrate now. Loaded with leaves, the limbs of trees provide to us their valued shade. To the waters we wend, in their warmth we swim, and we take to the roads for travel and leisure. For the fun and frolic of festival days, the things and moots, our thanks we give. We gather to gift our gods outdoors, with blue sky above our blessing steads. Hail to summer, that happy season. Enjoy the sunshine of these joyful days, and savor well the sounds I poured in the Skaldic mead I skillfully made.
I guess as the old Germanics divided the year into two halves, summer and winter, it also has its companion winter poem called Vettertímadraupa, which is structured similarly, and that's also available with the audio as well on the BandCamp download.
Right. Would you be able to give a link out for that?
Yes. One can find all the audio for these poems at eirikwestcoat.bandcamp.com. EIRIKWESTCOAT.
All right. And you can also find a link in the description below. Are there any, things that you wanted to discuss before closing for the day, I mean, there's a lot of things that we can touch on. I turn the discussion over to you if you want to add any additional remarks.
Okay, I'd like to say that for my new book, I'm very pleased to have finally got that published. It is available in a wide variety of formats. There is hardcover, paperback, EPUB, Kindle, and a PDF. And you can find them at all of the usual online retailers, such as like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple, and so forth.
Right. And I'll have a link for these as well.
I do plan more books, of course, in the future. And perhaps hope to be getting some of those out in maybe 2018 or 2019.
And you'll be, in the upcoming years, studying in Iceland, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. And so it's also been a time of transitions for me. I'll be starting a PhD at the University of Iceland this fall.
And now, what specifically are you interested in your studies? Have you given it a lot of thought, or are you kind of going with the motions and seeing what you're going to do?
I have my research topic, and that is a figure from Icelandic folklore, one that primarily occurs from the 16th through 20th centuries, although it also has medieval roots. That figure is sometimes called the Kraftaskald or Alkfæðaskald. Those are words meaning either power poet or spell poet. And these are Icelanders, and in some cases famous ones, who are said to have performed magic by means of extemporaneous poetic stanzas, usually uttered in a particular mental state. So I see there's definitely reflections of notions of the woad or madness or fury associated with poetry, and continuations of other medieval Icelandic notions of poets composing as fast as they can talk.
All right. Well, I'm sure that will be very fascinating stuff. I look forward to following your research, and I want everybody to check out your book, listen to the poems. I hope that you've all enjoyed this. I know I certainly have, and I'd like to thank you for joining us, Eirik.
Yes, thank you for having me on the show here, Dan.